You are holding a bottle of perfume that sells for around $150, and the liquid inside it? Worth somewhere close to $3. The other 147? Sitting in a bottle, a cap, and a box, dressed up to feel like the reason you paid for it. That ratio shows up everywhere packaging touches a product, once you know where to look. You've been trained to see packaging as a container wrapped around the real product. Across a huge share of the consumer economy, the packaging is where the money and the engineering really live. Okay, so picture yourself running a toll booth that sits on every road leading from a factory floor to a store shelf, anywhere on the planet. Every single product manufactured on Earth has to pass through some version of your booth before it reaches a shelf. The product riding inside? That's the traveler. You collect a fee every single time from every single traveler, and you collect it regardless of who built the destination on the other side. Following the money into this business starts with you choosing your lane, because your entry price ranges from close to nothing to tens of millions of dollars depending on which corner of packaging you pick. At the lightest end, you can enter with almost zero equipment of your own. You partner with a contract packaging operation, known in the trade as a co-packer, which runs your product through its machinery for a setup fee and a per-unit charge, with minimum order quantities sometimes as low as a few hundred units. You are renting space on somebody else's factory floor, machines already humming, by the batch. And if you route your production this way, industry research suggests you save around a quarter of what building your own line would have cost you. One step up, if you want your own single corrugating machine, the workhorse that turns flat kraft paper into the fluted 3-layer board every shipping box is built from. You are looking at somewhere between $20,000 and $100,000 on its own. Build a complete small to mid-size corrugated box plant, with cutting, printing, and slotting equipment included, and your bill lands around $300,000 to $1.5 million in a developing market such as India, Bangladesh, or Vietnam. All three are pouring capital into domestic corrugated capacity right now, so you would be entering a room already crowded with competitors. Scale up to a fully automated plant in North America or Europe, running hundreds of meters of board a minute, and your number climbs past $5 million, sometimes past $15 million. Shop for machinery in China instead, and expect to pay 40 to 60% less than an equivalent European or Japanese line. China dominates the machinery side of this trade entirely, and its own plastic packaging output alone is approaching 15 million tons a year. Choose flexible packaging instead, and you face the same shape of decision, starting lower and climbing higher. A basic blown film extrusion line, the machine that melts plastic pellets and inflates them into the seamless tubing that becomes shopping bags and food film, costs around $20,000 to $30,000 for an entry-level, single-layer setup you could buy today. The moment your product needs a multi-layer barrier film, the kind that keeps oxygen and moisture out of a bag of coffee or a pouch of baby food, your price jumps into the hundreds of thousands, and a serious co-extrusion line running 7 or more layers can cost you millions. The raw plastic barely changes between those two machines. What changes is the engineering you're paying for, stacking layers with different jobs, one for strength, one for a moisture seal, one for print clarity, inside a single sheet of film thinner than a human hair. None of those numbers are your real story though, so what's the single cost driver that will surprise you most? It lives inside a regulation that assigns your packaging a dollar value based purely on the material you chose and how easily it sorts at a recycling facility. Sell into the European Union, Canada, or a growing list of American states, and you now owe an annual fee, under a system called extended producer responsibility, for every ton of packaging you place on the market, and that fee scales sharply by material. Sell into Oregon in 2026, and you pay close to nothing on non-consumer corrugated cardboard. Sell the same job in plain paper, and it's around 5 cents a pound. Sell it in certain plastic containers and foamed cushioning, and it's more than $1.30 a pound. Over 20 times the fee, for functionally the same job of wrapping a product. Sell into the United Kingdom, and your base fee on plastic packaging sits around £455 a ton, against roughly £205 a ton if you had used glass instead. Sell into the European Union, and you are also funding a levy of around €800 for every ton of plastic packaging waste that goes unrecycled, passed down to you through your national compliance scheme. Here's the part nobody explains to you the first time you register for one of these programs. The fee schedules build in discounts, called eco-modulation, if you design packaging that uses a single material instead of a mixed laminate, carries a higher share of recycled content, or sorts cleanly at a recycling facility. Redesign a plastic pouch to use one material instead of 3. And honestly, you are often doing it purely for the fee schedule. The difference between the two designs can save you tens of thousands of dollars a year at mid-size volume, And industry estimates put the overall uplift on packaging spend from these programs somewhere between 15 and 40% if you skip that optimization. Get the redesign right, and it pays for itself through the fee schedule alone, independent of anything your marketing department says about sustainability. A second, quieter trick sits in how you finance your machinery. Under current United States tax rules, you can deduct the full cost of qualifying equipment, up to around $2.5 million in 2026, in the same year you install it, through a provision called Section 179, on top of 100% bonus depreciation for anything above that threshold. Already own a corrugator or an extrusion line outright? You can run a sale-leaseback, sell the machine to a finance company, unlock somewhere around 70 to 90% of its market value in cash the same week, and keep running the exact same equipment under a lease. I mean, on paper, you just raised working capital out of thin air. In practice, you moved an asset already sitting on your balance sheet into a form the tax code rewards more generously. Acquisition is your entry fee. What keeps you in this business is a different set of costs, and the largest of them sits almost entirely outside your control. Run plastic packaging, and somewhere between 70 and 90% of what you pay for resin traces back to naphtha, a product refined directly from crude oil. Move oil $10 a barrel, and your resin bill typically moves 5 to 10% within a month. In early 2026, a new wave of tariffs pushed polyethylene and polypropylene prices up more than 30% in a matter of weeks, to a 4-year high. And if you were running on thin margins with no cash buffer, you were one policy announcement away from a serious liquidity crisis. Run paper-based packaging instead, and your equivalent exposure comes from kraft paper and pulp pricing, plus the steam and electricity your corrugator needs, since corrugation itself is an energy-intensive process. Ask any of the French paper mill owners who permanently closed their doors in the past 2 years under exactly this kind of cost pressure. Layer on top of raw materials a cost you will almost certainly underestimate at first: skilled labor. Running a multi-layer co-extrusion line, color matching a print job to a brand's exact shade, and keeping a corrugator properly calibrated all require trained operators who take months for you to develop and are expensive for you to replace. Retention, more than the sticker price of any single machine, becomes the recurring cost that quietly erodes your margin year after year. Touch a brand with a reputation to protect, and you carry a category of spend that produces 0 physical units and exists purely to maintain appearance and trust. You pay certification bodies to audit your packaging as recyclable, compostable, or sourced from responsibly managed forests, and renewing those certifications is a recurring line item with no product attached to it. You pay design agencies separately, often tens of thousands of dollars per project, purely to engineer the unboxing experience, the sequence of textures, sounds, and reveals your customer moves through opening a box, because that sequence measurably raises how much your customer is willing to pay for whatever is inside. If you are honest about it, you would describe this spend exactly as it is: money spent purely on being believed by the person holding your box. You carry one risk that can erase years of accumulated value within months, and it almost always arrives through the same door: debt you took on during strong demand. Meeting a moment when demand and credit both dry up on you at once. Borrow heavily to expand during a boom, and you can find yourself unable to refinance that debt the instant a downturn hits, because the lenders eager to extend you credit during growth become unwilling the moment growth stalls. Add a geopolitical shock to global oil supply, a closed shipping strait, a regional conflict, a sudden round of tariffs, and if you run plastic packaging, you can watch your single largest cost line move by double digits within weeks, with no ability to pass that increase on to customers already locked into annual contracts with you. So, your packaging can generate revenue in a few fundamentally different ways, and which one you pick shapes almost everything about how your business behaves over time. The obvious way: you manufacture a box, a bottle, or a roll of film, you sell it once, and the buyer owns it outright. This is where you will find the vast majority of the global packaging market, valued somewhere around $1.1 to $1.3 trillion, and growing at roughly 3 to 4% a year through the middle of the next decade. Expect margins in the mid-single digits selling commodity products like corrugated boxes, occasionally reaching 10% if you run a tight operation, because your product is largely interchangeable and your buyers can switch suppliers with little friction. A second, far stranger way opens up if you stop selling your packaging at all. You own a pool of it and rent it out, over and over, to whoever needs to move goods through it. One operator built a revenue base of around $6.5 billion almost entirely on this model. Using something as unglamorous as wooden pallets, it owns a global pool of several hundred million of them, painted a distinctive blue, and charges a rental fee. typically $5 to $7 a month per pallet. Every single time a customer's goods travel from a factory to a warehouse to a retailer, close to 95% of its revenue comes from these per trip and per month fees rather than from selling a single pallet outright. Run a business like that, and you neither build nor use whatever rides on your pallets. You own the toll booth itself, collecting a fee every time something crosses it, and the same physical pallet earns you that fee hundreds of times over its working life before you ever retire it. A third, smaller but rapidly forming corner runs on that same rental logic, applied directly to consumer packaging. Build a platform around returnable containers, and your shopper pays you a refundable deposit, typically $1 to $10, depending on the container, to borrow a glass jar or steel tin instead of buying a disposable one, while you collect, wash, and refill that container dozens of times before it's retired. Your economics only turn favorable past a break-even point, usually somewhere between 10 and 50 rotations per container, which means your entire model depends on a return rate high enough to keep containers circulating rather than disappearing into somebody's cupboard. Get that return rate right, and you have converted a one-time packaging sale into a repeating subscription-like revenue stream. Miss it, and the extra handling, washing, and transport cost leaves your container pricier than the disposable version you were trying to replace. Zoom out to where you would be entering this business today, and one clear pattern should get your attention. Consolidation. In 2024, you would have watched Dublin-based Smurfit Kappa merge with Atlanta-based WestRock into a fiber-focused packaging company worth around $20 billion. That merger set off a chain reaction you would have felt regardless of where you operate. International Paper acquired the United Kingdom's DS Smith shortly after, and in early 2025, Amcor completed a $13 billion acquisition of Berry Global, creating a combined operator running roughly 400 facilities across 140 countries. The mechanism squeezing you if you operate independently is straightforward. Regulatory compliance costs, recycled content mandates, and raw material purchasing power all scale better across a footprint larger than yours, which steadily prices operators your size out of competing on cost alone. Set two segments of this business side by side, and you can see exactly where you would rather sit. Choose paper and fiberboard, corrugated boxes, folding cartons, craft packaging, and you hold the largest single share of the global market by volume, around a third, sitting in the lowest or zero-fee tier under most extended producer responsibility schedules, because your material recycles easily and biodegrades where it doesn't. Choose flexible plastic packaging instead, and you grow faster on a unit basis, somewhere around 4 to 5% a year, riding e-commerce and lighter shipping weight. But you carry the highest per-ton regulatory fees of any category, with your raw material tied directly to the price of crude oil. Pick paper, and regulation and consolidation pull you forward into becoming this industry's backbone. Pick flexible plastic, and you keep growing in unit volume while absorbing a rising structural cost burden with no clear ceiling, one set by policy decisions made far outside your control, in capitals whose choices you can only read about. A narrower corner worth your attention sits at the opposite end of the price spectrum entirely. Luxury and premium packaging, worth somewhere north of $35 billion globally and growing around 5% a year, covering jewelry boxes, spirits bottles, and cosmetics cases. Enter here, and your packaging cost as a share of the finished retail price runs the highest of any category in the business, often 10 to 30% of what your customer pays, occasionally rivaling or exceeding the cost of the product itself, the way it did with that bottle of perfume from the opening. Your margin gets set by perception rather than material cost here, which makes this corner structurally the opposite of commodity corrugated. You compete on pricing power instead of price. A separate, still-forming corner sits in India and other markets where extended producer responsibility rules are pushing you, as a brand, to prove exactly what happens to your packaging after a sale. Sell into India and expect your competitors to integrate QR codes and RFID chips directly into their labels for anti-counterfeiting and supply chain tracking, particularly in pharmaceuticals, where a fake or diverted product puts a patient at risk rather than just costing you a sale. Oh, and look at what Amazon is funding. A partnership with the Indian Institute of Technology in Roorkee to develop packaging materials made from agricultural waste, chasing a raw material stream that costs a fraction of virgin resin or purpose-grown pulp and sidesteps your oil price exposure entirely. Both corners sit early stage next to the trillion-dollar commodity core of this business, but both sit exactly where regulation, cost pressure, and unmet demand overlap for you, which is usually where your next packaging niche gets built. To see exactly how the debt risk from earlier plays out if it goes wrong, look at a business built the way yours might be. Chesapeake Corporation, a Virginia-based specialty packaging manufacturer, made paper cartons and plastic containers for the healthcare, beverage, and food industries. Through the 2000s, its owners expanded aggressively through acquisitions, the same growth path you might be tempted to take, building up roughly $521 million in debt along the way, with the stock trading above $20 a share at its peak. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit. Credit markets froze at the exact moment Chesapeake needed to refinance a $250 million credit line. Demand from its beverage and food customers slowed, and the company ran out of room to service what it owed. Its shares were delisted from the New York Stock Exchange in October of 2008 and closed at 6 cents apiece by year-end, down from over $5 just 12 months earlier. On December 30, 2008, Chesapeake filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and sold its operations for approximately $485 million to a group of investment firms, a fraction of what the business had been worth only a few years before. Take on debt during your own growth years, and this is the collision waiting for you the moment credit and demand vanish at once. The same mechanism repeated itself in 2025, an ocean away and in a completely different material category, so you should treat it as a pattern that could reach you rather than a one-off that couldn't. Klöckner Pentaplast, a global producer of flexible plastic and film packaging headquartered in Luxembourg, refinanced its capital structure in early 2021, during the height of pandemic-driven demand for packaged goods, leaving the company with close to €1.85 billion in first lien debt maturing in 2026. Once that pandemic-era demand spike faded, its customers began working down their excess inventory instead of ordering more, while raw material and energy costs spiked at the same time, compressing margins and straining liquidity until the company had no option left but a prepackaged Chapter 11 filing in 2025. Two packaging companies, on two different continents, in two different material categories, 17 years apart, borrow the way they did, sized for a boom, and a normal year is enough to take you down with them. Well, weigh this on a pure input versus output basis, and owning a standalone commodity packaging plant is a mediocre financial bet for you across most corners of this business. Your margins in commodity corrugated and flexible plastic sit in the mid-single digits, your raw material costs move for reasons entirely outside your control, and a debt-funded expansion can turn into a bankruptcy filing within a single downturn that catches you off guard. Open the spreadsheet, and the cells spell out a capital-intensive, thin-margin manufacturing business with limited pricing power, and for most of this market, the spreadsheet is right about you. Set the different corners of this business against each other, though, and your picture splits sharply depending on where you sit. Run a standalone regional plant without global scale, and you carry the most structural fragility, squeezed simultaneously by resin and paper price swings, rising regulatory fees, and larger consolidated competitors buying up your customer base. Run one of the consolidated global players instead, with dozens of facilities across dozens of countries, and you spread that same raw material and regulatory exposure across a footprint wide enough to absorb any single shock. Run luxury and premium packaging, and you capture margin through perception rather than volume, largely insulated from the commodity pressure squeezing corrugated and flexible plastic. Run the pooling and rental corner instead, keeping your equipment and renting it out rather than selling it, and you operate on a completely different mechanism entirely, recurring, contractual, asset-based rental income that resembles a toll road far more than it resembles a factory. Here's the thing though, a spreadsheet misses the embeddedness that pooling model builds for you over decades. Once a retailer's warehouse racking, a manufacturer's loading dock, and a trucking fleet all standardize around your pallets, switching away from them becomes an operational headache few businesses choose to take on. That quiet, unglamorous stickiness is worth more to you, over a long enough timeline, than almost any single year's profit margin. Every pallet, box, and bottle that has ever left a factory floor still has to pass through somebody's toll booth on the way to a shelf. And the real fortune in this business has always belonged to whoever quietly owns that booth, one crossing at a time. The only open question left is whether that booth is yours,